Welcome to Professor Anna Abram. Professor Abram was born in Poland. She studied at the Cardinal Wyszynski University in Warsaw and then received her Master in Theology and her PhD in Christian Ethics from Heathrow College. Her doctoral dissertation was an interdisciplinary study of moral development from the perspective of developmental moral psychology and virtue ethics. Professor Abram was teaching as a core lecturer in moral theology in an institute well known to many of us, the Missionary Institute London. Then she became the head of Pastoral and Social Studies Department and senior lecturer in ethics, Christian ethics at Heathrow College, University London. And today, currently, she is the principal of the Margaret Beaufort Institute of Theology in Cambridge. When we were looking for names for this day, there was quasi-unanimity to invite Professor Abram. Even people here coming from the Netherlands because of her. Welcome, Jan Jans. Today, Professor Abram will speak about fake news and the virtue of truth. What can we learn from Thomas Aquinas? Professor Abram, welcome in Leuven. The floor is yours.
It's a great honor to deliver this special lecture. Thank you very much for inviting me, especially to Professor Matthijs Lamberist and to Jan for suggesting me. Happy Feast Day. I am not an expert in Aquinas. I'm one of those beginners for whom he wrote his Summa. Neither have I much expertise in fake news. Well, I have made up a couple of stories in my life. But I have an interest in both and passion for connecting areas of inquiry that don't naturally fit together. And this is what I will attempt to do here. I will try to link the discourse of fake news with Thomas Aquinas. Let me start with a personal note. The reason for bringing in the personal is first because the current climate of fake news feels somewhat familiar, even if its scale and technical side are new. Secondly, the topic is so vast, and starting with my personal experience makes it more manageable. I was born in Poland during communism and brought up in the climate of fake news. The state and only media were full of propaganda, misinformation and disinformation. Nobody in my closest environment, unless it was a food recipe, a football match result, or a music review, really believed in the accuracy of information presented in the printed press and in broadcasting. Even our weather news was manipulated. There was always much nicer weather forecasted for the day of the Communist Party meeting. People in general didn't trust the official media. Luckily, at my own home and some of my friends' homes, and later through the church's underground organization, I was exposed to what might be described today as alternative facts. My formal education, especially history, was contaminated with untruth. Certain key facts related to the history of Poland were cleverly altered or completely missed. Some were totally made up, such as Lenin's visit to Poland, which in reality never took place. It's amazing to think that all these stories and poems I had to learn about Lenin were pure fantasy. And what's more interesting, some of them were really good. The creative imagination can flourish in all circumstances. But there were other stories, true stories and events, that were completely suppressed. For example, the history of the Katyn massacre in 1940, when 22,000 of Polish nationals were executed by the Soviet secret police in the forest of Katyn in Belarus. This massacre was never mentioned during my time at school. It was a forbidden word. We heard about Katyn. Both names, Katyn and Katyn, are very similar, almost identical. Yes, there was an tragic incident in Katyn, and it was deliberately exploited by the Soviet authorities to cover up the Katyn massacre and cause confusion, especially among foreign visitors. Katyn, not Katyn, became a total focal point for excursions and state visits by such dignitaries as President Richard Nixon of the US, Fidel Castro, Rajiv Gandhi, Yasser Arafat, and many others. As a teenager, I was learning to distinguish, in a probably too black and white way, between fakeness and truth of stories presented to me. Very early on, I developed a rather strong antagonism towards the state media, to the point of not allowing my parents to watch the TV. I would produce posters such as "The product of devil, do not touch it," or another one, "No TV in Lent," and stick these posters on the screen of our television set. I also learned that many good people are prepared to collaborate with systems of deception, and somehow quite successfully are able to negotiate between truth-based existence in private life and deception or lies in the public. Most of all, I have come to understand that even small outlets of alternative true facts can in the end change the culture and course of the history. In the end, fakeness of fake news in communist Poland came to the surface, communism fell, and alternative true facts became essential building blocks for the free country. I was lucky to have access to an interest in true stories and facts, and witness a genuine human sacrifice on the account of truth, and connected to it a link that St. Thomas makes with justice. I was inspired by people like Adam Michnik, a historian, essayist, former dissident, public intellectual, editor-in-chief of the Polish newspaper Gazeta Wyborcza, who was imprisoned several times for speaking the truth. Another lesson I learned is that even if we are on the right track when dealing with fake information and communication of truth, we are always affected by blind spots in our historical and social consciousness. In Poland, the Jewish-Polish question has always been uncomfortable and has been a blind spot, and again the country is forced to come to terms with some new uncomfortable facts and learn to deal with the fake stories which are circulated about both Jews and Poles. These blind spots are deeply rooted in other things, usually in our beliefs about the world, ourselves, even God. In the UK, my second home, where I have lived for over 26 years and have its citizenship, it is still hard to face the truth of its colonial past, its relationship to the non-British other, including the European other, as it was exemplified in the Brexit referendum. There are all kinds of analysis of fake news related to Brexit. I won't bore you with them, but for example, The Independent publish a whole list of them related to Brexit. The UK Parliament is not a great example, perhaps, not especially now. However, there is something that I think it's worth mentioning. The UK Parliament has been conducting since 2015 an inquiry into fake news. Not many people seem to be aware of this inquiry, but a very interesting work has been done by what is currently called the Digital Culture, Media and Sport Department. In February this year, its select committee chaired an investigative meeting at George Washington University, Washington, D.C., during which big tech companies, media groups, businesses, universities were questioned on how they address the challenge posed by the contemporary fake news culture. The recording of this meeting is available if you want to listen. It's about 7 hours long, but it's really interesting. And there is an ongoing consultation with the public who are invited to define and comment on the impact of fake news and the impact fake news has on public understanding of the world, and also on the public response to traditional journalism and whether objectivity and balance have any value today. Almost now close to 100 papers have been submitted from journalists, media companies, academics, companies and charities, but only one religious organization is represented. And this is a public consultation open to everyone. And this comes from British Council of Muslims, which is a very interesting, it has a very interesting list of all sorts of fake news, misinformation, disinformation about Muslims in Britain, and not only in Europe as well. It's not easy to define the phenomenon of fake news. The term can refer to a variety of things: completely false stories, farmed news, and more difficult cases such as heavily twisted or partially inaccurate news. The British Guardian defines fake news as fictions deliberately fabricated and presented as non-fiction with intent to mislead recipients into treating fiction as fact or into doubting facts. Admittedly, it is not always clear what we mean when we say that we want the media to present the truth. But a democratic society depends on the idea that there can be some sort of shared approximation of the truth about actual events. It seems important to stress the role of intention in presenting information and distinguish between intentional deceiving and rushed, unchecked, badly formulated formulation that can be interpreted in a variety of ways. So fake news and flawed journalism are not the same. The deliberate and intentional misleading makes fake news a clear-cut ethical issue. There are many other issues. For example, political technology consultants now use personal data to micro-target political messages tailored to each user. Such companies claim to understand an individual user's emotional responses and how to trigger them. There is also some evidence that Google's search ranking system can be manipulated and controlled by right-wing propaganda people. According to one research, hate sites are now dominating searches on Muslims, Jews, Hitler, and women. Research by the British Observer found that a search for Jews are, if you Google Jews are on Google, led automatically to a prompt for Jews are evil. And then there was a whole list of results. 9 out of 10 articles were arguing that Jews are indeed evil. Fake news is a symptom of a much bigger issue. Fake news disseminated for ideological goals can have much more serious societal and political implications than fake news disseminated, let's say, for financial goals. The term fake news is being taken over by politicians and journalists alike, who decide to call a piece of information fake news because they either want to discredit the source or simply because they do not like it as it looks upon them unfavorably. On Tuesday, I heard on the BBC radio, another phrase that's been introduced by a legitimate politician from another country who called his opponents in the discussion country a fake country. Propaganda is not illegal, but a number of those who are concerned by the culture of fake news suggest that it should be better challenged. Another big concern, noted especially by those who work in the area of human rights, is that fake news is fueling discrimination and hate crime. Hate crime has been shown to have spiked following a vote for leave at the Brexit referendum in Britain. Fake news to fuel propaganda against Muslims, for example, has in the UK reached almost the majority of the mainstream media. Other areas where fake news abound are climate change and immigration. In addition, misinformation about vaccination has contributed to reduced vaccination rates and subsequent outbreaks. Anti-science ideology is endemic online. It is common that when the data is presented, it is often inaccurate and deliberately vague. A study in the British Medical Journal found that around 40% of press releases about health stories contained exaggeration and that these were directly transmitted into media coverage. The Royal Statistical Society in Britain, in their submission to the governmental consultation, argued that present floating facts about medicine, science, and technology will become a crisis that undermines public health, environmental security, and economic well-being unless there is a strong political leadership and determination to ensure that the public are protected. It is important to add that in my research of the topic, I was not able to identify any robust data on the exact impact of fake news on people's decision-making. There is much general and anecdotal data. One thing that I was able to trace relates to the last presidential election in the US, a Pew study which showed that the main source of news for Trump supporters prior to the election was not Facebook, but Fox News, and this finding cast some doubt, perhaps, on the impact of fake news. Luciano Floridi, professor of philosophy and ethics of information at the University of Oxford, is calling for something like an ethical infosphere. And he says, we need this to save the world and ourselves from ourselves, end of quote. He admits that restoring that infosphere requires a gigantic ecological effort. We must build, he says, we must build trust through credibility, transparency, and accountability, and a high degree of patience, coordination, and determination. So when it comes to fake news, we are dealing with an array of technical, technological, legal, philosophical, psychological, political, and most of all, moral matters, all of which require attention and understanding, as well as proactive decision-making. Addressing these issues would be far beyond the scope of this paper, so I want to focus on a couple of them, in my view, which these issues are core issues which for me are inspired by Thomas Aquinas. So I will look into Thomas's view on the human desire for knowledge, his approach to lies, his position on the virtue of truth, and his attitude to education. And the reflection will be short and very sketchy, and I apologize for this. So the first theme in Aquinas is the desire for knowledge. All human beings by nature desire to know. This statement from Aristotle's Metaphysics appears many times in Thomas's work. Our involvement with fake news, I think, is connected to this natural desire to know. Desire to know is essential for human beings. Human beings, precisely because they are human, aim at knowledge as their end. This is not an empirical observation, but according to Thomas, a pronouncement about the essence of our humanity. For Thomas, knowledge is the actualization of the natural human potentialities, the perfection of the human being. So my question is, can fake news serve that end? It clearly cannot, as fake news is not truth. Knowledge presupposes truth. But what about fake news for a good cause? If good is achieved via fake news, then perhaps the perfection of the human being can take place. We will come back to this point very shortly. For now, let us accept that Thomas's proposition that all knowledge, that is scientific, systematic, theoretical knowledge, omniscientia, is good. Clearly not everybody agrees with this. There is, for example, the Nietzschean question concerning the value of truth and whether we should want it at any cost, even if it is odious and detrimental to our being. Should we still want it? St. Augustine and Bernard of Clairvaux question the idea of knowledge as good for its own sake. Bernard claims that there are people who want to know solely for the sake of knowing. And that is, according to him, scandalous curiosity. He gets this from Augustine, who in the Confessions calls curiosity as a vain desire cloaked in the name of knowledge. Curiosity, for Augustine, is the temptation to seek knowledge for its own sake. So for Augustine, knowledge has an instrumental value. I don't think Thomas has a problem with knowledge as being instrumental. So for him, the human desire to know is not a vain curiosity. Human beings marvel at things and desire to know the causes of what they see. This is an exact quote from the Summa. It seems that for Thomas, knowledge has both instrumental as well as intrinsic value. Thomas, however, has some problems with our desire to know, and this is when curiosity occurs. Just very briefly to summarize, the way I read it, curiosity occurs when we have an excessive desire to know about things that prevents us from fulfilling our personal and social duties. So, for example, my interest in rabbits and my desire to know all about them, especially the Belgian breed Mini Rex, a type with whom I lived for almost all my life in Britain, can become a problem if I start neglecting my personal and professional duties. Thomas cites the case of a judge who is obsessed with geometry, and that he arrives in court ill-prepared to hand down informed decision in prosecution of justice. According to Thomas, we should also be careful about our sources of knowledge. Curiosity occurs, and this is a quote, when a man studies to learn from one by whom it is unlawful to be taught, as in the case of those who seek to know the future through the demons. Curiosity also occurs when there is a desire for knowledge that ignores its end, that is God. And finally, in Thomas, curiosity occurs when we study to know the truth above the capacity of our intelligence. I find this point very, very difficult to understand, but I think it's, and some commentators suggest that it's connected to pride, because the prideful person hopes to achieve some good beyond the measure of his or her own inner strength. The antidote to curiosity is studiosity or studiousness. It has two roles, of which the primary is to curb or to control the appetite for knowledge, for reasons that we have now considered. By contrast, its secondary role is to reinforce intellectual desire. So any difficulty encountered in the pursuit of knowledge is strengthened by studiositas, when, for instance, we face difficulties in resisting the pressure to conform to prevailing opinions, or in dealing with laziness, for example, when we don't want to study what we should. But going back to the desire for knowledge as being natural for Thomas, the proper fulfillment of our natural desire can consist only in the contemplation of God's essence, in the vision of God. From this, Thomas draws the conclusion that our complete happiness cannot consist in theoretical knowledge. Perfect knowledge is the knowledge of the first cause, God, and it is different from theoretical knowledge. For Aquinas, certain truths are made known to us by revelation. By this he means direct action of God. So in the background of all this is my question, how we determine what counts as fake news, whether what we see as being revealed is true or fake. Human beings have disordered tendencies. When I was preparing this paper, I talked to my friend, an atheist, and his one and only point to what I was telling was, oh, but good news is fake news. But let's leave this point for the time being. So, just very briefly, fake news is attractive to us, as to some extent it fulfills our desire for knowledge. Fake news doesn't give us any knowledge in the Thomistic sense, except perhaps that the truth helps us to recognize that fake news is fake. There is a link between fake news and vain curiosity. Studiousness seems to be a virtue for our time. Perhaps we need studious fortitude to nourish our soul and have stamina for engaging with fake news in order to change the culture. Or perhaps even a kind of stamina that I refer to myself. Why? I haven't bothered. I'm interested in this topic, and I haven't bothered to organize or work with other people and submit something to the British government consultation. No theologian or philosopher, apart from those who work on communication, has done this. And just very briefly, fake news as a lie. If we agree with the Guardian's definition, which I gave earlier, of fake news, then I think we can straightforwardly say that fake news is a lie, a statement believed by the liar to be false, made to another person with the intention that the person can be deceived by this statement. Would Thomas justify fake news for good cause, something that many philosophers and theologians would approve? There is something called noble lies. Could we speak about noble fake news? Plato and Nietzsche are in favor of noble lies. Machiavelli not only would permit fake news, but would say that fake news is necessary for exercising leadership. The prince cannot be a good leader without lying. Now, I have to disappoint you. I am not really clear whether Thomas is totally opposite to lying. He does say that every lie is a sin, and Thomas uses a natural function argument to explain why lying is wrong, in which he says, for as words are naturally signs of intellectual acts, it is unnatural and undue for anyone to signify by words something that is not in his mind. End of quote. It seems problematic to make natural functions of organs normative and it doesn't seem to be consistent with Thomas's thinking on the use of reason. To use the natural purpose of language, something made by human beings to serve their purposes, as a reason for making lying wrong, is not compelling. It would not be convincing to suggest that fake news is wrong simply because it may not reflect the content of the mind of the one who verbalizes it. In fact, if we only relied on this analogy of the mind and language, we can even argue that fake news is right as long as it corresponds to what is in the mind of its originator. Someone who is motivated by hatred can easily put into words the content of her mind. But there is another way of thinking about moral permissibility of fake news for good cause by applying Thomistic just war criteria, and I have come across a couple of authors who do that. One of them is Maureen Ramsey, who in her co-authored book, The Politics of Lying, Implications for Democracy, she does it exactly that. She suggests that at times when national security is concerned, lies and deceit are permissible. She recognizes that there are legitimate and illegitimate uses of a lie in the same way that there are legitimate and illegitimate uses of force when it comes to conflicts between nations. On the first criteria of just cause, the justice of a lie would depend on the cause for which it is undertaken. One would need to know whether there were other means available to achieve the just end, whether the harm caused by the lie is outweighed by the good achieved, and whether there is a reasonable chance of success in achieving the end through these means. Moreover, the means would have to be justified not only because politicians would be acting in our name and in our interest, but because the public would have to consent to the deception in advance in order to comply with democratic principles. The point is that it seems plausible to try to make a case for something like a just fake news theory, but we would need much more detailed scrutiny in order to endorse it. So now I move to the point on the purpose of communication and the virtue of truth. In question 100 in the Summa, Aquinas, Summa Secunda Secunde, Aquinas speaks of truth as a virtue. He is not concerned with truth as that by which something is said to be true, the point we considered earlier on, but with the disposition, sometimes translated as truthfulness. He is concerned with a moral skill or a habit by which a person makes speech truthful. The virtue of truth moderates which truths are spoken, so that there be neither too much nor too little said. Joseph Selling, in his Reframing Catholic Theological Ethics, helpfully describes these virtues and many other virtues in line with his trapezoidal presentation of Thomistic virtues as a quality on the continuum between truthfulness and discretion, with bluntness and mendacity being the extremes, the two vices. This virtue regulates the sphere of communication with other people. In later articles of 109 question, Aquinas discusses the vice of saying too much about oneself, boasting, and the vice of saying too little, irony. But Aquinas discusses the virtue of truth or truthfulness in the context of the order of communication. Christopher Tollefson, in his Lying and Christian Ethics book, notes two directions in Thomas's approach to communication. One, the order of communication looks outward to the things about which communication is being engaged, the things spoken of, and the truth about those things. And the second, that this order looks inward, signifying the truth about the mind of the one communicating. And he concludes that in this bidirectionality, communication looks both to the good of society, we can say the common good, and to the good of personal integrity or moral maturity. Speech and language are instruments available for making something known to another. But the effort itself and the ordered relationship between words, things, and the self is an act of reason. It is a willing manifestation or disclosure. So it is in deliberately bringing that which is to be communicated to another through signs that then an order of communication is established. Aquinas is keen that his readers grasp the purpose of communication. Something, he says, since man is a social animal, one man naturally owes another whatever is necessary for the preservation of human society. He notes that life in society is impossible without trust, thus the need for the virtue of truth. The virtue of truth secures communication of truth, and that communication is done by people with moral integrity who communicate truth in a morally skillful way out of their personal dispositions. Without the communication of truths, there can be no society at all. There would be no shared plans, no common way of acting, no mutual pursuit of goods. In the absence of a willingness to communicate truths, or in the absence of trust that others will participate in the ordered communication of truth, there can be no stable society. It is worth noticing that Aquinas' virtue of truth or truthfulness is closely linked with the virtue of justice. But I won't talk about that link, although I think it's very important. When I arrive in Leuven and ask you for directions to the university, and you kindly offer them to me, I am not just listening to your words. I am trusting you. There is a personal dimension in our encounter. It is likely that you are taking personal responsibility for ensuring that I understand you. Such interactions for Aquinas are basic. They are what creates community. There is always a dynamic of giving and receiving in communication. By giving me direction, you saw in me a stranger, but also someone who is like you and who can benefit from the truth you know. You shared it with me, and I hope to share it with somebody else in a similar situation. This basic dynamic can be transferred to other acts of communication in all sorts of areas: media, politics, healthcare. Aquinas also speaks about communicating oneself or communication of oneself. And I quote, that truth whereby a man, both in life and in speech, shows himself to be such as he is, and the things that concern him, not other, and neither greater nor less than they are. For Aquinas, simplicity seems to be part of the virtue of truth, insofar as it is opposed to duplicity, which is showing one thing outwardly while having another in the heart. Showing oneself as one is thus an essential aspect of communication. Using these Thomistic insights, it seems that neither good society nor the goods of personal integrity can be preserved in the fake news culture. Genuine communication is difficult in such culture. Fake news makes building and preserving trust difficult. One could reverse the point and say that fake news damages trust and makes human society disintegrate. If I had more time, I would have liked to mention Bernard Williams and his book on truth and truthfulness, because there are interesting parallels between him and what Thomas suggests. And there is just one claim that I think it's important to point out. William claims that we should interpret the phrase, the value of truth, as a shorthand for the value of the various activities we associate with truth. For me, the most important point that Williams makes is that if we lose truth, we lose something important. The value of truth embraces the need to find out about the truth, to hold on to it, and to tell it, particularly to oneself. I'll read this again from Williams. The value of truth embraces the need to find out about the truth, to hold on to it, and to tell it, particularly to oneself. And this takes us to my final point of this lecture, which is education for truth in the culture of fake news. Vivian Bolland, the Dominican, points out that for Thomas, the preferred analogy for what the teacher does is the work of the medical doctor. Just as the medic cannot replace nature, but can assist it in various ways, so the teacher cannot replace the student's intellectual process, but can assist them in various ways. The above analogy prompts us to see education as accompaniment of the students. In the digital world, perhaps this means not working against, but working with the digital natives, but also with people in the media, in politics, and looking for ways of assisting them, raising with them those points on curiosity, studiousness, knowledge, truthfulness as commitment to truth, but also personal virtue with veracity as well as simplicity as its elements. So the question is how to create an environment in which truth is questioned but also loved. In the prologue to the Summa, Thomas considers how newcomers to his teaching are greatly hindered by various writings on the subjects. I have a long quote, but I will just summarize. The key point of Thomas's approach is a desire to, I would say, to formulate or to propose, and this comes exactly from the text, a sound educational method. A sound educational method. So it seems that Thomas's main reason in the Summa is to challenge the teaching methods in place and to replace them. Instead of forcing students to pursue the subject according to established methods, and here he talks about theology, but we know that he talks about theology always in conversation. Instead of forcing students to pursue the subject according to established methods, he proposes to follow what he calls a sound educational method. What does count as a sound educational method in the culture of fake news? I think Pope Francis touches upon this in his message for the World Communication Day, and the message is entitled, "The Truth Will Set You Free, Fake News and Journalism for Peace." Francis talks about the education for truth, and his Ignatian method is about teaching people how to discern, evaluate, and understand our deepest desires and inclinations. So this is teaching for truth. Teaching for truth is about teaching people how to discern, evaluate, and understand our deepest desires and inclinations. Francis is worried that constant contamination by deceptive language can end up darkening our interior life. Education for truth is meant to enlighten our internal life, according to him. He says, to discern the truth, we need to discern everything that encourages communication and promotes goodness from whatever instead tends to isolate, divide, and oppose. For him, it is about building genuine relationships. Truth, he says, is not really grasped when it is imposed from without as something impersonal, but only when it flows from free relationships between persons from listening to one another, end of quote. So the education for truth has to be person-centered. For Francis, the key priority, and this is his phrase, is people over strategies. The best antidote to falsehoods are not strategies, he says, but people who are not greedy, but ready to listen, people who make the effort to engage in sincere dialogues so that the truth can emerge. To go back very briefly to Thomas, let us note whom he considers as best teachers. I find this really a controversial a bit for someone who is trying to read and speak and write. First, for Thomas, the best teacher is Jesus, the most excellent of all teachers. But he also mentions Pythagoras and Socrates, the greatest teachers among the pagans, none of these wrote, which seems to indicate that the greatest teachers do not write. In the Phaedrus, Plato speaks of the inadequacy of writing and the superior value of oral teaching. For Thomas, writing is simply a means to the end of teaching, which is to impress one's teaching on the hearts of one's listeners. The best teachers do this directly. So perhaps Thomas's advice for those who are in the business of education for truth today is to find ways of awakening passion for truth by giving personal witness. There is the most recent theory as part of a kind of development of virtue ethics that I've come across is Exemplarist Moral Theory, a very interesting book, a few months ago, has been published by Linda Zagrzebski on this theme, and she uses Jesus and some Greek philosophers as best examples for moral maturity and for moral development. When Thomas considers Jesus, he points out that his primary task was to serve truth. And in carrying through the task, he was the best or most excellent of teachers. He shows how to serve students. He becomes a slave by washing his disciples' feet. He becomes a teacher by dressing appropriately and sitting like a master on his chair to explain the meaning of what he has done. This is what Thomas reminds us or shows us in Jesus' behavior. So, for Thomas, teaching ought to be done in tranquility. Thomas adds that it is by sitting and being quiet that the soul becomes wise and prudent. Perhaps this kind of tranquility is very difficult for us in our busy world, but it is something worth keeping in mind. Perhaps providing spaces for silence and giving people opportunities to learn to be silent is a way of building tranquility. I'm quite impressed or amused almost. There is a new institute, or new building of already existing institute in Cambridge, the Wolf Institute, which is dedicated to interreligious dialogue. And in this really beautiful building on the grounds of Westminster College, they built this large space which does precisely that, allows people to come and be silent. And this is one way of doing interreligious dialogue for them. So in conclusion, by using Aquinas' reflection on truth, I was hoping to protect us from fake news. I tried to identify in Thomas some key themes that perhaps in conversation with other thinkers and discourses, for example, Hume on honesty, or Annette Bayer's very interesting work on honesty and candor, can be brought into this kind of dialogue, but also other disciplines, psychoanalytical approaches to self-deception, some philosophical works on authenticity and sincerity. I have also come across, when preparing this paper, very interesting work by epidemiologists, and if I haven't done this, but I would be really interested to try and apply criteria that epidemiologists use in identifying some problems with our fake news culture. I think there are interesting interdisciplinary conversations to be had for theologians. As I was writing this paper, especially when thinking about my own personal experiences and the current hot topic in Britain related to the poisoning with the nerve agent of Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia in Salisbury last week, I became convinced that the basic issue here is not the accuracy of data and algorithm of Google, but how we can protect ourselves from false ideology and to know that we are living in truth. The problem is made much worse by the threat of self-deception. How can we really guarantee that we are being truthful to self and other? The second question, on which I touched already, is the question: how are we to respond to people who see the good news as fake news? And in our media, there are many of those. And this is probably something that Thomas would find maybe hard to believe. I might be wrong, but he definitely would engage with this question, I think. Given his approach to education and the way he engaged with science and philosophy and thinkers of his day, I can well imagine him engaging with atheists. Perhaps he would be writing or blogging in his elegant and systematic way on various issues that concerns us today. I imagine him considering the theme of artificial intelligence or presenting this topic and doing so in a much more coherent way that I have done. I don't think there are quick and easy answers to the points and questions I try to raise. I would be interested in your thoughts later, but for now, thank you very much for your kind attention.